Putin's plan is falling apart again. The Russian president's decision to welcome up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers into Russia was meant to be a show of strength. For the first time in this war, foreign troops, beyond mercenaries, are officially part of the conflict. Putin wanted the world to believe this move symbolized his alliances and bolstered his position, but instead of reinforcing Russia's fight, it's become a colossal failure. The North Koreans have been thrown into a brutal battle for Kursk, where Russia lost 450 square miles of territory and over 90 settlements to Ukraine's surprise counteroffensive in August 2024. Now, Ukraine is refusing to give an inch, and the results are humiliating for Putin. In just 48 hours, Ukrainian forces wiped out an entire battalion of North Korean troops, dealing a devastating blow to Russia's counteroffensive. And here's the kicker, these were supposedly elite soldiers. So what went wrong for Putin? And what does this all mean for North Korea's future involvement in Russia's faltering war? We start with the news. During his January 4th nightly address to his nation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reported that brave Ukrainian fighters in Kursk had wiped out an entire battalion of North Korean soldiers. For context, a battalion is typically made up of between 500 and 1,000 soldiers, though the numbers can vary. Some battalions may only contain a few hundred soldiers, with others meeting the full quotient of 1,000. Regardless, destroying an entire battalion means Ukraine has just eradicated a substantial portion of the troops North Korea sent to Russia to support Putin's efforts to retake Kursk. Worst of all for North Korea, it's experienced these massive losses in just 2 days of fighting. The commander-in-chief also reported on the situation in the Kursk region, Zelensky told his listeners during his daily address. Specifically, in battles today and yesterday near just one village, Makhnovka in the Kursk region, the Russian army lost up to a battalion of infantry, including North Korean soldiers and Russian paratroopers, and that's tangible, Zelensky concluded. The news will be a massive morale booster for a Ukraine which is struggling to hold on to Kursk. Reports suggest that Russia has managed to reclaim about 40% of the territory Ukraine took in the oblast since it launched its counteroffensive toward the end of 2024. That's on top of Russia controlling about a fifth of Ukraine's territory and making slight gains as a result of its push in the Donetsk region. You'll also notice that Zelensky mentioned North Korean soldiers and Russian paratroopers in his address. That tells us that Russia is mixing and matching within its battalions, trying to mingle North Korean soldiers with Russians in its assaults on Ukraine's defensive positions. A tactical blunder, perhaps, especially given the massive language barrier will still exist between these disparate groups of soldiers. Perhaps communication breakdowns within the Russian battalion could be the reason why Ukraine experienced such massive success over the course of just 2 days. That's speculation. But what we know for sure is that an entire Russian battalion containing a substantial number of North Korean soldiers now lies decimated on the Kursk battleground. The news comes on the back of more reports, this time from Ukrainian military commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrsky, that suggest that Russia's counteroffensive in Kursk isn't going to plan. As we mentioned earlier, Putin amassed 50,000 soldiers to retake the territory. According to a January 1st Telegram post by Syrsky, Russia's losses had surpassed 38,000 in the oblast even before Ukraine decimated the predominantly North Korean battalion. Zelensky's report also comes on the back of another from South Korea's spy agency that Ukraine had managed to capture an injured North Korean soldier in Kursk. Unfortunately, that soldier died of his injuries while in Ukrainian custody, meaning Ukraine likely couldn't get any valuable information out of him about Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. Still, all of this adds up to one clear conclusion. Putin's use of North Korean soldiers in Kursk isn't going as well as he'd hoped. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who understands the state these North Korean soldiers were in when they arrived in Russia. The London Evening Standard published a report claiming that North Korea's soldiers still hadn't joined the Kursk counteroffensive as of December 6th. The reason was simple. They were so poorly trained that they could barely even serve as cannon fodder for Putin's meat grinder. One Western official said, "We say due to poor training and lack of logistical support as the primary reasons why DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, haven't started the fight yet." Instead, North Korea's troops were taking up secondary positions in areas held by Russian soldiers, clearing the way for those Russians to push forward while leaving the North Koreans behind in defense. That's clearly changed now. North Korean soldiers are on the front lines in Kursk and they're dying in droves. This is despite the fact that North Korea supposedly sent its elite soldiers to Russia. It's believed that a large portion of the 12,000 North Korean soldiers that arrived in Russia were part of the country's special forces Storm Corps. These are supposedly the best of the best that the North Korean military has to offer, but best is a relative term. As a North Korean defector named Hanul revealed to the BBC on December 20th, the Storm Corps may be the best that North Korea has to offer, but that still puts them a long way behind Ukraine's battle-hardened forces in Kursk. Hanul, who spent several years in North Korea's army before his escape, says that the Storm Corps were the most well-fed soldiers in the country's military. But again, this is a relative term. During his time in the Storm Corps, Hanul lost 22 pounds within a month on nothing but a diet of moldy cabbage and cracked corn. After 3 months, his entire battalion was undernourished to the point where it had to go to a special recovery center to gain weight. And when these supposedly elite Storm Corps were deployed for the first time as frontline guards, the food situation didn't get any better. Rice may have replaced corn, but there wasn't much of it by the time the food reached Hanul's unit. Rear units siphoned away most of the rice, with what reached the Storm Corps being cut with sand to make it seem like a decent meal. These are the elite soldiers North Korea sent to Russia. Underfed troops that were so malnourished that they could barely operate. But hey, at least the Storm Corps undergo more rigorous training than the rest of North Korea's soldiers, right? Well, not so much. Another North Korean defector from the unit, Lee Hyung-sung, says that the DPRK only selects the tallest and most athletic people to become part of the Storm Corps. Lee even had a hand in training them, claiming that he taught the soldiers martial arts and how to create makeshift weapons out of kitchen utensils. But that sort of training isn't going to amount to much in Kursk, where Putin is feeding his North Korean soldiers into the same kind of meat grinder he's created in Ukraine. The Storm Corps needs to know how to use weapons effectively, and that's another area where North Korea's elite fall, according to Hanul. During his time with the unit, he claims to have only fired 3 live rounds during a single training session. He, along with most in the Storm Corps, never raised his gun in anger. The closest he came, says Hanul, was an encounter with a farmer who strayed into a Korean demilitarized zone on the hunt for food. Hanul sent the farmer on his way, breaking protocol to shoot any intruders in the process, and his gun remained unfired. That's all a far cry away from the propaganda videos of the Storm Corps, which show them shattering entire blocks of ice with their bare hands and pulling chains off walls. And it gives us some much-needed context as to why Ukraine was able to wipe out an entire battalion of these supposed super soldiers in just 2 days of fighting in Kursk. The Storm Corps aren't elite soldiers. They're barely even regularly trained soldiers. North Korea's troops are little more than poorly trained and underfed minions that not even Putin felt confident enough to send to the front lines as cannon fodder when he first received them. And even with some extra training from Russia, those soldiers still have to deal with the language barrier and the fact that they're fighting against Ukrainian troops that have spent years defending against Russian soldiers. The North Koreans never stood a chance. That's why an entire battalion of them now lies in tatters. Worse yet for North Korea, the Storm Corps are supposed to specialize in infiltration. They reportedly trained to find their way behind enemy lines and wreak havoc with the enemy, only that's not happening either. Putin is sending these soldiers to the front lines in Kursk, and he's reaping the results that everyone expected. His North Korean soldiers are dying or getting injured in droves because they're not up to standard, and Putin is using them in a way to which they're unaccustomed. It's all just more evidence of the tactical ineptitude Russia has shown throughout Putin's entire special military operation, and it leaves us with a question to ask: what happens next? The odds are pretty high that even more deaths and casualties of North Korean soldiers await us. Putin isn't going to stop his Kursk counteroffensive until he's retaken the lost territory or exhausted his troops. The latter scenario is starting to look more likely than the former, especially when you consider what's happening to Russia's North Korean soldiers beyond this most recent loss of an entire battalion. A day after Zelensky revealed the destruction of the North Korean battalion, he appeared on American podcaster Lex Fridman's show. The interview became prickly at times, especially when Friedman suggested that Ukraine could simply try forgiving Putin to bring an end to the war. Zelensky quickly shut down that suggestion by pointing out that nobody could reasonably consider forgiving anybody who had killed thousands of his country's people and decimated so many cities. But even amidst the tension of the interview, Zelensky revealed just how effective Ukraine has been against the North Korean forces which it fights in Kursk. He revealed that around 3,800 North Korean soldiers have already been killed or injured in the region so far. For those keeping count, that amounts to roughly a third of the 12,000 troops North Korea is believed to have sent to Russia. We've already touched on some of the reasons why North Korea's casualty rate is so high. Their elite troops are nothing of the sort, and the soldiers Russia has received are poorly trained. But there's another reason why so many North Korean soldiers are dying. According to White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, Putin has been using these soldiers to carry out human wave attacks against Ukrainian positions. Often left to attack on foot with minimal support and shoddy weaponry, the North Koreans are now being used as cannon fodder to soak up Ukrainian ammo. Putin's idea is simple here. The more ammunition Ukraine expends on North Korean soldiers, the less it'll have to defend against attacks by more competent Russian troops. The situation is so bad for North Korea's soldiers that many are resorting to taking their own lives ahead of being captured by Ukraine in Kursk. Kirby speculates that this is because many fear for the lives of their families back home. After all, they live in a country that monitors practically everything they do. That monitoring hasn't stopped because the soldiers are now in Russia. Some North Koreans are dying by their own hands because they'd rather be reported as dying honorably in battle to reduce the risk of North Korean President Kim Jong-un taking revenge on their families. There is some disparity in these North Korean casualty figures. Back in late December, Zelensky claimed that Ukraine had killed or wounded over 3,000 North Koreans. So it's added around 800 to the North Korean casualty count in a little over a week, if Ukraine is to be believed. But at the same time, South Korea believed North Korea's casualty rate was closer to 1,100, accounting for about a tenth of the soldiers Kim sent to Putin. Either way, these are massive losses. The destruction of an entire battalion could add up to 1,000 to these numbers. Assuming that Ukraine's late December tally of 3,000 was accurate, it would make sense that the number is now around 3,800 following the wiping out of the battalion. And loss has been the story of North Korea in Kursk. Even back in mid-December, when Putin was just starting to roll his North Korean soldiers out onto the front line in Kursk, the losses had started mounting up. A single clash with Ukraine's defense forces between December 14th and 15th cost North Korea at least 30 of its soldiers. The casualties have only ramped up from there as Putin pushes more of Kim's soldiers to the front. So we know that the North Korean soldiers aren't going to stop coming until their numbers are completely depleted. Putin's human wave approach means most of Kim's soldiers are going to die as little more than cannon fodder for the meat grinder. Even those who seek escape will kill themselves ahead of being captured or deserting for fear of what might happen to their loved ones back home. At this rate, we could expect the entire North Korean contingent of 12,000 soldiers to be exhausted by the end of March or the beginning of April. If Putin hasn't retaken the lost Kursk territory by then, Russia will be left in a very bad position. Zelensky certainly has his ideas about what should happen next after the destruction of the North Korean battalion. It's something he's called for since late 2024. Ukraine's president wants China to use its influence over North Korea to prevent the deployment of more of Kim's soldiers. Zelensky may see the wiping out of this battalion and the 3,800 casualties Ukraine has inflicted on North Korea so far as a message to the DPRK and China. North Korea would do well to stop sending soldiers or they'll face the same fate as those who came before. The Korean people should not lose their people in battles in Europe, Zelensky has claimed in the past while talking about China's potential influence. If China is sincere in its statements that the war should not expand, appropriate influences on Pyongyang is necessary. China has certainly made those claims. Back in September 2024, the country's foreign minister Wang Yi even stood before the United Nations to warn fellow world leaders against an expanding Ukrainian battlefield. The top priority is to commit to no expansion of the battlefield. China is committed to playing a constructive role, claimed the minister at the time. But just a couple of months later saw the very expansion that China claimed shouldn't happen as Russia started fielding North Korean troops. Still, what China says and what it does are often two very different things. Ukraine likely can't rely on China to apply any sort of pressure on North Korea in the wake of the battalion destruction. The loss of the troops alone may have to do that. The East Asia Forum says that China is unlikely to condemn Russia's use of North Korean troops, even if it's wary of the strengthening of the relationship between Putin and Kim that the use of these soldiers represents. Ukraine's other option is to keep building on the battalion decimation. There are plenty of signs that it's doing so already. Zelensky was slated to attend the 25th meeting of the Defense Contact Group as we were writing this script. Held at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the meeting brought together over 50 nations, collectively known as the Ramstein Group, to discuss the security matters of the day. Most members of this group are also NATO and European Union members, with the group having been formed in April 2022 in the wake of Putin's Ukraine invasion. This particular iteration of the meeting was supposed to take place on October 2024. It was postponed as President Joe Biden had to make time to deal with the aftermath of Hurricane Milton. Right now, the meeting represents the last chance Zelensky has to gain more support from Ukraine's allies, especially America, before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Zelensky is trying to butter Trump up before he takes office, even taking to Ukrainian television to say that Trump can be decisive and that he's capable of helping Ukraine to stop Putin in his tracks. But you have to imagine that Zelensky will use the 25th Ramstein meeting group to secure a few more donations of military equipment that his country can use in its defense of Kursk. Speaking of Kursk, Ukraine's also taking things into its own hands by launching a counteroffensive in the oblast. On January 5th, a day after Zelensky announced the destruction of the North Korean battalion, news began to emerge of a renewed Kursk offensive. Rather than sitting back and defending the positions it already held, Ukraine started to launch attacks in several directions in the oblast. Russia's defense ministry claimed it had already repelled 2 of these counterattacks by January 5th. Russia claims that a decisive response included support from artillery and aviation, allowing it to destroy the Ukrainian counterattackers just 9 miles from its border with Ukraine. It's wise to take these claims with a pinch of salt. After all, Ukraine claims the counterattack to Russia's Kursk counteroffensive is going well. CNN reports that Ukrainian presidential office head Andriy Yermak posted to Telegram on January 5th to state, "Kursk region, good news. Russia is getting what it deserves." Regardless, it's clear that Ukraine feels like it's in a position to launch attacks against Russia and its contingent of North Korean soldiers in the wake of destroying an entire battalion in Kursk. Whether the Ukrainian counterattack is the result of renewed confidence or desperation on Ukraine's part remains to be seen, but there's one thing that's almost certain: Russia will continue attacking. And that means North Korea stands to lose even more than the battalion Ukraine decimated on January 4th and the 3,800 or so troops it's lost so far. More human waves means more North Korean deaths, which brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video: will Kim Jong-un send more of his soldiers to fight for Russia in Kursk? Zelensky thinks that's a possibility. During his podcast interview with Lex Fridman, Zelensky said that North Korea has the ability to send an additional 30,000 to 40,000 troops to the Kursk front. That would almost double the entire counterattacking force Putin amassed in his initial push to retake Kursk, with those soldiers adding to the massive meat grinder he's already created. They can bring more, Zelensky told Fridman. 30 or 40,000 or maybe 500. They can bring many people. Why? Because they have order, autocracy and everything. And therein may lie a sign that the worst isn't over for Ukraine yet. It's done an amazing job taking out an entire North Korean battalion in 2 days, along with 3,800 North Koreans throughout Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. But Kim has more soldiers waiting in the wings. And if Radio Free Europe is to be believed, Kim isn't fazed by the North Korean losses so far. If anything, he's preparing to double down on his support for Russia, knowing that every soldier he sends to Putin means he gets more cash, oil, and military secrets in return. So is Ukraine's destruction of a North Korean battalion in Kursk a sign that the battle in the oblast is going in Zelensky's favor? Or could it be the signal Kim and Putin need to ship even more North Korean soldiers into the embattled region? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out First Storm Shadow missile strike kills Russian general and hundreds of North Koreans, or click this other video instead.